state, first of all, that we have got, as you well know, many, many millions of dollars more in requests than we've got funding for. And so there are a couple of things that we've kind of talked about, and I think it's good that we kind of restate them. And that is, the best example is the administration proposed the blueprint pilot, and it would be a 2-year pilot. The House funded it for 1. The administration's come back, and we've talked about it, and that is, if you're doing a pilot and it's 2 years, then you should fund it. Otherwise, you're running the risk that there won't be $1 million. You put a lot of time, you put a lot of resources in. So if something is needs a 2-year commitment, we should make it. And now we've got the money to make it. I would suggest that we all need to realize that our fiscal future, and Senator Westman keeps saying that we are probably in the best money times that any of us have experienced, and yet we don't have enough. I mean, the demands are insatiable about how we could spend the money. So to simply defer something that we know is an obligation or inherent in setting up a project, we do it. And I was just next door. One of the things that we have done is made a commitment to retired teachers on the COLA methodology. But in order to do that, you have to deal with the underfunding impact on changing the COLA methodology. And so the House did not budget for that commitment for next year when it would go in for the 9.1, which is the amount the actuary had determined would need to be put into the pension fund so that you don't deliberately create underfunding. To me, that's an example of where, if you've got a commitment and you know you have to pay it and you've got the money now, you use it to fulfill known and existing commitments. We have had a lot of difficult times digging ourselves out from when we have deferred or partially funded or whatever. And those lessons tend to get forgotten too easily. But I would say that not funding the pension obligation and say, well, we'll deal with it next year when we do the experience review is deferring a known obligation. And so I just made a request of the Finance Committee in the Education Deal Bill to reserve out of the funds that are available that known obligation that we have negotiated with NEA. So as we go through this, I will just say that remember this, it's easy to defer or say things will be better or next year, we'll do this or that. Next year, it's probably not going to be as good as this year. And so our goal here and challenge is what is a sustainable base and what is one time, and what are we going to say? We know it's good and it could have a benefit and the need is articulated, but it's not going to be sustainable. So let's run through this, but I hope that it kind of gives us a framework as we're making deliberations around the amount of money and how we allocate it. So we're starting at the top, and do you want to run through this?
Sure. Stephanie Barrett from the Joint Fiscal Office. The one page here you have in front of you, along with your, I think the binder is a signal of how big the budget and how many choices, just trying to be organized. We've usually done it in packets and not a full binder before. Anyway, so one page you have in front of you is just to ground the conversation as we start what I'll call the slog through the part of markup, like writing part of this. But the big GF picture, which we're mostly talking about the GF, but the example that the chair just gave was in the education fund, back in the education fund. But we all start with the same box of revenues based on the forecast that's adopted in July. And then the decisions that collectively each body makes, like whether it's revenue, impacts the revenue up or down, or spending decision that impacts spending up or down, those all have to still fit into a balanced position for the fiscal year. And as I've been listening through the course of your testimony, this was just summarizing some of the themes which have already been touched on. The theme of finding a way to find the match for the IIJA needs that are out there, because those are known dollars that we can draw down, federal funding.
And committee, they're in two different places. One is transportation and the other is in water, wastewater and water systems, which are infrastructure, which is really important. So we have two areas where those federal dollars could greatly benefit, and a lot of the water sewer is really necessary to support housing. So making sure the match is there is.
Am I right that the House had no match?
That's right. Well, they didn't put a fence around the match for the water, wastewater and water systems. They left it, but they didn't sort of corral it.
They didn't dedicate it to the water on their capital bill side, but on their transportation bill side, they have a gap where they would finding that needed match next year and the year after would still be there's still a gap there.
Even though they did
Raise the fees.
they did raise the fees. So even though they did that, the match did not get addressed. I will say this. And part of that, in all honesty, and I know I'm getting off, but they reserved, we all know that they passed the family leave and medical bill. And that has startup costs of $111 million.
Okay.
And so, because it would create a Vermont insurance company, basically. And so they took one-time money of $37 million, or a third of that 111 off the table to support only a third of the startup of that expansive leave, which is something that we've had reservations about. How much can you do, and you know, how much revenue can you raise all at one time. So our child care bill is fully funded, the positions, even, you know, et cetera. But so we haven't talked about one-time money in that way. So 37 million has been set aside for that. And that obviously has reduced the one time that they have to draw down federal dollars. So we'll just keep going.
Can I ask,
Sure.
either ask or comment? So it says here, very high bar for new programs. And so during the whole ARPA process, new programs have been put in place, or minor, major or minor. So are we considering those? Are we now going to start over with those and say, these are new programs that we have to consider at a high bar because they were funded through the federal ARPA?
Yeah, I think you do, but I'm talking about even the House has new ones that haven't even been funded before.
No, exactly. There are some that have been funded before, and now there are other new ones. So I'm trying to put them all together into one bill.
I think we're gonna have to, because there are many programs that were started with the federal dollars that either you're gonna have to raise revenues to support them.
Right.
And the universal meals bill is gonna come over,
They're all
and
equal.
that came in with the COVID money, and that's gonna require a 3-cent increase.
Now the school.
It does, but it comes out of the ed fund, but in order to generate 30 million, you've got to increase property tax rates by 3 cents to generate the money to support the benefit. So that's an example.
There's still money in there. There's a surplus in the.
Well, that's a one-time.
It's a one-time surplus, the same as general fund. It's not ongoing. So So that's an example, if you want to continue that benefit, then you've got to fund it by increasing revenues, raising revenues. So it is, right now, I think there's 20 million in reserve in the ed fund, one time. And with the teacher's retirement payment into the retired teacher's payment into the pension fund, there'd be about 10 or 11.
Switching that up to
Yeah,
9.2 or so.
once you fence off that 9.1. So that's an example of a program that the decision was to continue it, but you've got to raise the revenues to support it on an ongoing basis. Because the ed fund doesn't have that much capacity to pick up 30 million of costs.
But didn't we lower the ed fund tax
No.
last year?
No,
Did we buy it down?
Yeah, I think we did.
it fluctuates, a lot depends on the school budgets. But for every $10 million of spending, it's about 1 cent on your property tax. That's the normal.
So rule of thumb.
Yeah, that's a rule of thumb. So, so that's an example where a decision was made and the House has passed a bill that would raise the money to continue that program that was started as a result of the federal dollars. So let's keep going. We've got fully fund. I've already spoken to that. There are 2 areas where that came up with. If we're going to do the blueprint, either we do it for 2 years or we don't do it. Simple as that. And the ADS network, and the secretary spoke very passionately about how fragile the state executive branch network was. We know that the judiciaries have their concerns about the stability of the network, but as the secretary pointed out, you also need to have a stable network for DOC because they're doing the remote hearings, and you have to have it for the state's attorneys and all the other parts of the judicial system that are supported by the state network. So there was concern about that would leave a gap of 7 months, and and we're talking about a network that supports all the functions of government. So why you would not want to meet that need and recognize it at once, I think, is another example of where we're having to set priorities. And I think our network for both the judicial system and the executive branch is really critical to the functioning of state government. So that's the ADS network. Just back to, that was a Friday afternoon testimony from Secretary Sean Naylor on that one. Where sustainable streams, well, we've talked about that too.
Yeah, so that was a theme that came up in terms of if you were going to, sort of patch over with one-time money versus finding sustainable positions for some of your base service provision programs, and the one that the mentoring. Last year, you tried to put the district commissions into a stable funding stream on the clean water. You did a little bit more in the general fund, but the House is doing one-time money to them. So those pensions will be part of what you walk through.
We gave them one-time money last year because they needed equipment or training or something.
But you also
we did increase
you did
the
a
base.
small increase in the base for them, which is ongoing.
And I don't think they asked for $1 million of one time. They want base funding.
They do.
So that's another example. And then this is the new program that I guess that talks about, I think, new, and our programs are brought online that came with federal funding, and the extent to which we feel that they were a priority for the competition of ongoing base general fund. Because we started a lot of programs we know we just could never continue with state funding. So,
And then the other piece that's not written here, but you touched on is that balance of getting the baseline amount right for what the future holds, which, based on our forecast right now, is a relatively modest growth rate in the general fund of 3%. So, the starting point in the middle of the page here,
How many million is that?
so that's what we're going to. It's,
3%?
so the 3% is about $50 million. A little over $50 million
Mutual
growth rate.
Pay Act and a few other things,
And
you use it all up. So we thought it'd be helpful to track where we were with, because the forecast, we started in July, and then January, it was updated, and then, so this is a way of helping us track through what we have for general fund.
this base look will be informed a lot by, how, when we get to the end of the month, what our collections look like through this tax season. But through the end of March, we are ahead, but a chunk of that is one-time money due to it, of singular events. And so far through March, we're sort of holding steady with where we were through February. We're seeing growth like the way we were last year. Last year, every time we turned around, the revenues were coming in higher than expected. We seem to be pretty modulating at the moment.
And so you can see on the right, Stephanie indicated that growth 3% equals the 50 million. We shouldn't have million after the $50.
Okay, I should have it in there. That would be helpful. So the forecast and the estimated direct apps and reversions for 24 give us that $2.13 billion, almost $2.14 billion starting point for 24. And last year, and the upgrade in the forecast, July and January, and the way FY23 ended, we do have $333 million of one-time money that's come forward from 23 into 24. There is a small error. The House ended up doing 337. That was a JFO error just on the balance sheet from the BAA. So we accidentally let them overspend by $2 million. So you'll have to fit actually to 335. Sorry. And then you have taken some actions in this body that have actually expended money. You've sent some bills out with appropriations. Many bills you strip the appropriations and they're on our list of requests, but the heat standard bill went out with $1.72 million. That's accounted for. The flavored cigarette ban, that costs you $3.5 million of base revenue. That means your base will be starting at a smaller level than the House. They have not passed that yet.
And if they don't pass it, we'll get it back.
But this room will build the budget. We have with.
But in the meantime, we have to build it on what we voted.
But some have said that number is very low.
Well, but some of the figures have,
The 3.5 is.
Those that don't like it.
The ones that don't like it.
the joint fiscal also,
Well, I mean, why not be
Let's go to
honest with
Massachusetts and
what
buy
you're doing?
well, this is joint,
I have to
the
believe that.
figure that I've heard was like 15 million. But that was before it was adjusted that some people would continue smoking. It was just what they smoke. And then, and the other was, it was over a 3-year period that gave you that bigger number. It was not an annual figure.
We'll all be sitting here next year, so I guess the proof's in the pudding.
It's gonna break us.
Well, it means we have 3.5 million off the top that we can't spend.
And that's ongoing base revenue. You do have a small up in revenue from the pass-through entity bill, the S45 bill that you passed, the $500 million.
Okay.
So that's in the opposite direction. You passed out the legislative compensation bill with the appropriation in it last week. Your child care bill is essentially neutral. It has $88 million and change of appropriations in it, but it has offsets in terms of the child tax credits that you killed, and the governor's budget of $56 million or $49 to $56 million that's applied there. There's sort of a little bit of an outstanding question. Are you applying the entire amount of the after-school program be money in the governor's 56 million to this or a portion of it. And then as you walk through and mark up the bill, that will become clear. And then you have your pending list of the asks from the various public hearings, what you've taken out of bills, and what has been received and sort of transmitted to your staff along the way as the requests for funding, whether it's based ongoing funding or one-time funding.
So
And then,
and examples of that, we put on down best 100 on housing, so we can look at what we've done for the BAA and other requests. We pulled out on the setup of a investment, the retirement fund,
Do we,
750.
yeah, we need to pay attention to the 37 million the House put into internal paid for.
No, not right now, we don't.
Plus, one of the committees puts a bill
I don't believe that's likely.
And the 37 only is 1/3 of the startup.
Yeah.
So
How can we start new programs if we don't fund the ones we have?
I didn't pay you to say that.
So paid for.
It's true.
But it is true. I mean, I think I'm really frustrated. You know, I spent some time with the director of our local parent-child center this morning, you know. And I've also spent time with the people from other agencies that have been operating for years. And they're either well-funded or slight increases. I really worry about the idea of starting new programs.
Well, I think
And it's not 37 million, it's really 100 million.
111. I think our pro tem has been very clear on that our priority has been childcare. And childcare is a pre-exist, it's a program that has been around. It was operated by SRS back in the early 70s. It's been a program that the state has had in place for a long time.
Funny you mentioned that because I had a conversation in the men's room with a constituent of mine who's
Obviously,
actually
well-
runs a big business, one of the biggest, best businesses, who is up here to testify on childcare. That's their priority
Mhm.
as a business person.
Are we in the position at this point, as we're constructing the budget, hopefully in the last 3 to 4 weeks, month of the session, that our job in here is to accommodate for what the Senate has passed and accounted for. And at this point, even any bill that came out of the Senate to do that would have to go through this committee, and if we don't budget for it, it has to wait.
Or we're gonna have to negotiate it. So I'm thinking that we just need to know, that's why they didn't have the money to be the match for the IIJA, because they took a big chunk of one time and went to support a bill that we have pretty much that our priority is childcare at this point.
So this 37 is on top of the payroll deduct.
This is for their bill for this, yeah.
Before the
Paid for
payroll
the
bill that they did.
this is the House's bill and
The House is
So
bill.
that's 56.
No, that's our childcare bill. This
And
is,
I thought we raised,
We did, we
Payroll.
did fund it through that.
so you
this thing,
It says to be determined.
that's on the House side, the childcare bill is yet to be determined. They haven't put out a childcare bill yet, but they have put out a leave bill, their H66 bill. And that bill contains a $37 million appropriation of general fund for 1/3 of the startup costs of that leave bill.
That's only for information. It doesn't mean that
Yeah, it's just a context.
we don't have to,
But
but
at this point, it doesn't seem to be moving in the Senate. And at this point, we have to someplace cut bait and start to put the budget.
well, I think also we're gonna be setting what are our priorities here in the Senate. And our Senate priority has been childcare and adequately funded. That seems to be the other thing we like to do, and that's give everybody a little something, but it doesn't amount to much of anything for anybody. And that means that sometimes you have to make harder decisions. as I call it, Alice in Wonderland budgeting. All shall be winners and all shall have prizes, but at some point, you have to say where is the highest and best use, and and what are our priorities and how we adequately fund them. And so this is just more informational.
Yeah, it was just a contextual sheet for starting. There are a handful of other house tax bills that have smaller amounts, but quite large amounts of money that we have on the list.
And
The list of S bills, the appropriations that we've taken out, what's that dollar number?
we have it.
Because that would basically be deducted, or it's, well,
No, we
So,
don't,
we
no, we're
don't know if we're gonna do it.
That's right.
It's got 90 some odd million of housing on that list.
A little bit.
So I actually
it's
didn't.
over 100 now.
Yeah.
But
It includes that for,
those
you know,
are bills that pass the Senate.
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering.
We have to accommodate for.
We have it right here. I mean, the Senate, Stephanie's got a list of it, so these are some examples of, remember, the curriculum audit. That was 200,000, we removed that. The question was, are we coming up with a statewide curriculum? Then they had 350,000 to tourism and marketing to promote higher ed in Vermont. That came out of education. Vermont saves, I don't know, Stephanie didn't total it.
Can
It-
we
it-
get a copy of that?
Yeah, we will give it to you.
Yeah.
So we have a list here, and it adds up to quite a bit because there's about 80 million in just S100 on housing that came out. So there's quite a bit. So
But we may decide with that list, we have to accommodate for it, but we may decide that something gets a later start and.
Or does it doesn't get fun.
a later start is only getting the camel's nose in the tent. It has to be
Well, I'm
annualized.
just making a suggestion that the number may not all be the same that's on that sheet.
Could be, or some of the things we're gonna say just aren't, once they're weighed out against all the spending requests,
Right.
just don't get funded this year.
Yeah, some of those things you just dream of,
Well,
wouldn't it have been,
350,000.
and the other,
wouldn't it have been
Right, yeah, that's a good.
the other thing that I would mention before we actually start going into the language, which was gonna be our next step. One of the things that I asked and spoke to Senate Finance about, and that is the transportation bill as it came out of the House, included updating transportation fees. They haven't been updated since 2016, although the statute requires them to be updated every 3 years so that the increases are more manageable. The transportation plan, actually, there's a structural deficit in transportation because the revenues into the transportation fund are not sufficient to even serve as the match to draw down the normal FHWA money. So everybody's focusing on the match for the new federal dollars, the IIJA money, but within the transportation program right now, the revenues are not sufficient to have the match that's needed to draw down the money.
And it's a widening gap.
And it's a widening gap, and so the governor's proposed budget was to use one-time general fund money to serve as the match for that ongoing base program cost, which we have said it's not a good budgeting practice using one-time money for base. So we've got that as well as the IIJA match. So
Is there-
Westland,
and how
that's
short, based upon the fee bill that passed the House, even if the fee bill gets done, what's the gap between that fee bill and what the match that we would have to make for in both cases, in the underlying transportation bill and the IIJA?
The match for the FHWA is about 10 million.
Yeah.
And the fees based on what got passed in the House start in January, and would generate about 8 billion for next year. So it pretty much,
And then the.
and then after that, for a full year would be 21 million. So it would provide adequate revenue to support the regular match for the federal highway aid, plus would allow some to be used as the match for but it won't totally cover it. And the estimate of additional general fund money to ensure that we have the match for all the available federal funds under IIJA are like $25–30 million. We're trying to get a fix on it.
It's around $3 million for FY24, but another $25 million to pull down what they see for 25 and 26. And that's the range that we're in right now.
25 total for those 2
Yeah.
years. Oh, 25 each.
So 28 total, the 3 that you need this year and then the 25.
There's no way of using one-time general fund to fill that and then using some of the federal money to fill the whole one time in the general fund.
It all has to be matched.
Pardon?
FHWA is all matched. You have to have 20%.
Other money, like, I know ACCD's got like 40–50 millions over there as far as I know.
That's, I mean, to the extent that it's, yeah, it's federal ARPA money that has to be spent on.
You can't match
You
federal
can't
with
just drop
federal.
it into our treasury.
It has to be spent
And
on.
you have allocated it all in the work you did last year and the year
We
before.
appropriated all the ARPA money, in last year's bill. We
How
finished it
many
up.
years is that?
Through
gonna
26, they have to spend it. So one would hope it, we know it hasn't all gone out, and it wasn't intended to go out all in 1 year, because it can be spent up through 26. So in essence, we're dealing with a structural deficit and at least not requiring every dollar match needed for the IIJA comes from,
It's 30
general.
something million.
Right.
and that's one-time money.
Pardon?
That's one-time money.
That's all you need is one time to cover that match.
Well, that's where we're getting it. To get to the 25 to 30 that we're talking about. Because the House didn't budget any of it. So that's how you get your one-time money, is you're gonna say, we want it, we need it for match. So you're right, that's where you would go, Bobby, right there.
And we do have the spur of the governor's veto threat if he doesn't get some match money.
I don't,
Yeah.
I realize that he's rattled that saber, but I was gonna say, I think the governor's just agreeing with me.
In terms of,
Now we have the money, we have the obligation, reserve it. And don't expect that next year is gonna be better and you're gonna have more money to deal with than you've got this year. I don't believe you're going to. So, yes, that is a priority to make sure all those federal dollars are drawn down. But I think that most of us would say that is a goal that we agree with.
yeah, sure. And, on the fees, my question there is not whether we need to do them. It's the calculation, because because it's been left so long, it's a pretty dramatic rise. Is that something we need to back the House on, or is that a discussion to be had?
Well, we can have a discussion, but the problem is, these are usually, you have an option for 1 year or 2 years. So if you do it, then it becomes very hard to predict, and you're gonna get half the money, because people would just say, let's do I'll go for the 2 years, so I'm saving money on the second year. So it really does affect the amount that you're able to calculate, and it also means that you've got to update those fees.
That 20%, it does make you wonder. I mean, I read some article this weekend, and we have the highest registration fees in New England.
I don't know. I know that in New Hampshire, you have to pay a personal property tax
Right,
at the
right.
time of registration as well. So states have different taxing
Massachusetts has it.
personal property tax
Property tax every year.
on the value of your
On the
vehicle,
value
your
of
boat,
vehicle.
your trailer, et cetera.
Well, I don't know about boats and trailers.
Well, it's,
I know cars,
it's personal property, yeah.
but probably.
Snow machines would be another, motorcycles.
What a
So it's
car,
hard to compare states sometimes.
It's hard to compare unless you look at the whole package of everything you do. The fuel taxes, the everything together.
And if you don't do it, then, and you've got a real problem in your outer years with the structural deficit of the T fund. And frankly, we never officially understood that statutory requirement, so we've been complicit in the situation that's been created.
I would say that even if you do that, you have a structural deficit in the T fund, this just alleviates a portion of it.
Well, no, it's, unless you've got more federal special funds coming in 27.
You'll have a new, transportation bill within that period of time. And when they reauthorize transportation bills, they almost never reauthorize the transportation bill without some sort of an increase.
so if, how long is the 80 million? That's just for 1 year, or is there 80 this year, 80 or next year? and
80 is,
80
I rounded off, it was 78. It includes being the match for the FHWA for 3 years and all the match required for the IIJA. So it came to a total of 78 million
So
at one time.
if that money is for 3 years, why don't we do something with the fees to cover it over 3 years? And then it wouldn't be such a bad hit on anybody. I mean, or go 10% for 3 years and 10, and 10, and 10. And then you wouldn't at least get that big jump of 20 at one time.
And you have to find more money to get the match, because the fees are already short.
Yeah, but isn't that spread over 3 years?
It's
Or-
10 million a year just on the federal highway match,
Oh,
30 million thereabouts.
for both.
For 30 million over the 3 years, 10 million a year just for the structural deficit and the business as usual. Then you've got, which means you have no T fund available to match on any of the transportation IIJ money. So by having the fees, you're able to address the structural deficit and have some money to apply toward the IIJ match. But even after that, it will still take 25, 30 million of general fund to fully maximize all the transportation-related federal match.
So you got
Yeah.
two things.
Yes, you got two things that are coming. And so I agree. No one and this is an example of, well, we don't want to do something, we'll postpone it. And when it comes back at a larger amount. And then you're exactly in the situation when we're talking about underfunding an obligation, when you have to pay it, it becomes more painful. Or if you don't maintain the regular update cycle. And the same thing is happening in OPR with some of their fees as well. So, so that is,
You can obligate the next legislature though with debt. I guess you can, we have, or somebody has in the past.
Well, it's just match. If we didn't have the match, then we just wouldn't be able to do
yeah,
the
we
project.
just wouldn't draw down.
We would lose that federal money.
You don't have the money to draw.
So we pay it while we're here this year.
So it's,
If you don't set aside when you've got this one-time pot, then, me? Oh, Senator Sears.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, is this about the 200,000 we're losing in licenses?
Oh, good.
Oh,
You'll get 200 grand.
There, I think it's on suspended
I
licenses,
shouldn't have
right?
to explain
Yes.
this.
The bill that
I'm not
has
reporting.
an impact of 200,000.
I will accompany senators.
What?
I will accompany senators.
But he did a fiscal note on business. I think they're taking up H553, an act relating to driver's license suspensions. And what it does is has an impact of a loss of 200,000 into the T fund because of the reinstatements and the fees paid. But it's a good policy from a policy perspective.
Reinstating without the fees?
They're not ever revoking the license to begin with.
Yeah.
Less people would get their license revoked.
Because most of them are losing it because they get some fee that they can't pay. Then we take the license away, they
You
can't
ever
go to work.
gotten a ticket?
What's that?
Most tickets, there's more fees added to it than the ticket cost.
Yeah, you're right.
And
Well, it says,
I don't know that from my own.
anyway, license suspensions are considered really
Somebody told you that.
quite a penalty because people can't get to work or they drive with their license suspended. So it is bad. So that's why Senator seriously. So now that we've sort of gone down the relationship of the transportation bill and fees, I did mention to the finance committee that those fees, we would like them to review them because that's their jurisdiction, not ours. Yes.
I would just say in the transportation, during the Obama administration, in the Great Recession, we had infrastructure bill go through and we had a big slug of federal money come for transportation, then we had the match. Then we had Irene come and our revenues in transportation were helped enough through both of those, that with those bump ups that we got above the regular transportation, we were able to take advantage of the federal money and increase the quality and our standing when it came to bridges. We now have IHAA that we're able to do something about. Mostly in the governor's budgets, it's on the back of the general fund to do that. Our revenues in transportation are not in a healthy place. And if in 3 times in the last 15 years, we've had those bump ups, I'm looking at this and saying, how do we make transportation a little better in the ability to pick those things up and move to a better spot in the overall? And to sit back and wait on any of this seems foolhardy.
So I'm putting the shovel in the ground.
Versus another, well,
Shouldn't that,
the problem is the longer you delay, the
The
worse,
worse you are,
the worse you are. Unless you get into some kind of pro rata arrangement, but then you haven't really dealt with the structural problem in the long term, and you're having to deploy more general fund to service the match.
and part of my point is, if anything happens and there's any break in it, you have no opportunities if you're trying to already climb out from under the rock.
So, just to let you know, that's, the use of general fund in the budget as presented by the governor, perhaps has been unique in this year. Simply for that reason. So, and I would like to remind people that there is a transfer, it's called the JTOC transfer, it's $20 million, and it goes to public safety. And there's been some discussion, should you ever take any money, but the fact is, it goes to support highway law enforcement.
So where does that come from, Jane?
Comes from the T fund. But
Even to the state police to do police for policing on the interstate highway system.
You never see them.
you do, well,
No, they don't want you to see it, but
Well, maybe there's
Hide
an
it.
accident, you might see them, but.
Well,
Post-COVID, there is a much lower presence.
Oh, there is, because they were out there having trouble filling all their vacancies. Although they do patrol certain roads, like Route 4 on the ski weekend, where you've got all that traffic off the mountains and stuff, they were out in force, for example. So I think they probably target certain roads at certain times for enforcement, but,
You'd almost think their money was coming out of the general.
that's the argument.
Has transportation talked about putting a surcharge on electrical plug-ins?
yes, that's very much a topic.
But, I mean, well, because it seems to me all the other suggestions I've heard really target residents, Vermont residents, rather than any car that's traveling through the state.
Yes, and that's a topic of discussion and study, as Andy knows, we've spent a lot of time on that. But it's less than perfect.
How would you do it? You're out of
You're
state.
gonna have to do it through the companies that are, the electric companies that are providing electricity.
And other people are saying they'll be
They're gonna
charged for
plug in.
monitors.
Oh,
Any
you mean
car
when
that
charging
plugs
station.
in,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're trying
Yeah,
With that new sticker system that DMV is instituting,
the yellow stickers.
the yellow ones, I mean, you drive in there and they zap that.
But they know exactly.
More about your car than you've ever dreamed of knowing how many miles you've driven.
And that's the technology that would support the vehicle miles traveled. There's been some
That's the way it
suggestion that
should
you should use it for everything. Of course, you've got your federal gas tax, it would still be there. I mean, that's a combination of state and federal when you fill up. And then you've got your plug-in hybrids, and then, so all of that is being studied by your transportation. As I said, right now, the number of EVs is relatively small, so the revenue impact is about $1 million. It was about 900,000. And the environmental groups have recommended that the volume of sales should be 15% as a triggering point to put in whatever taxing method you want to have. But it's not precise any more than if you bought your fuel in New Hampshire and you're driving in Vermont, or so unless you get into high tech and GPS, you're not going to have. Now for trucking, it's all done because every time you cross a border, but there's a whole mechanism to redistribute the
Push the
tax.
button
Yeah,
and
yeah.
New
So-
York starts, and then you push Pennsylvania and that's.
So every time you cross a state border, if you're in that kind of travel. So
But
now you're in the world of
the
transportation.
little fee that we're talking about, that's $400 a unit.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, the fee increase for the big trucks. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
I'm still worried about the truck.
Like
You charge
Belvane's
like
has got 80 of them and 30 of them are sitting because he can't get drivers, so he's got 50 of them, but they're all registered.
Well,
He'll be a little upset.
well, maybe he'll just register the ones that, you can always register them when you need, if you have. The
Just
next
in
thing
time.
is, if you have the drivers, that's the other thing, Roland will say, you don't have the drivers, so.
And then we'll use the money to fix the bridges so he can get his trucks over. So otherwise he'd have to.
You tell me your constituent.
I know.
I'm not.
Yeah, you tell Roland. So Stephanie, we were gonna start on language.
We were, since we normally spend at least a couple of days, you talked a lot about, heard a lot about testimony on the hard gold money numbers pieces. But as a committee, we start to walk through the language bits. The first, the A section of the bill is the boilerplate front of the section. You have a tab that says language on it, that's where I want you to go to.
Oh, and it starts after one.
And it should be on page 34 of the Word document.
We got through that first there.
On 34?
Yep, it should be page 34 of the as passed by House.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
She put a little thing.
Yeah.
And we're gonna start halfway down on line 11 with the C section of the bill,
C-100.
C-100.
C-100. Everybody got it?
So just a reminder, the C section of the bill is the effective on passage. These are sort of further adjustments after the BAA. And section C-100 brings forward that money from 23 to 24. And the change we need to make here is we need to make that number
705.
335, yeah, 337 needs to go to 335. We have to do this because if you did not do this, the 335 would follow through the end of year construct. And half of it would flow to the rainy day fund and half of it would flow to the pension construct. These are in the forecast right now, so they're not in, the pension construct is for unidentified surplus. This is identified surplus, and so that's why we need to. If we don't write the language to bring the money forward, there's no mechanism to bring the money forward.
Should be 335.
Yes.
You have a question?
Well, so do we have a carry forward that will be split between those two funds? Like what?
So not when we do this. Now, if receipts come in higher than the forecast, then that would be the.
So you don't know
mechanism. Yeah. Yeah.
But we will know,
We'll have
fix
we'll have
by
some-
the next week.
Yeah, we'll have some understanding of what that starts to look like.
But won't we just spend that?
Yeah, well, we have
We have a-
contingents, well, there are certain things that we
Yeah.
may have to say, if there's money to support it, then that's how we will use those extra dollars.
So then, so like if in July there was excess receipts in June that we would, then,
If they haven't been appropriated, then they would be subject to the split.
and then we can do that in the beginning next year.
No,
Or they're just
happens
automatic.
automatically.
They flow into the places they go to. I mean, then you don't have any,
Right.
unless you were gonna take an action to take them out, which would not be advisable. So
Well, we
unless,
could act-
unless it was really raining for the rainy day fund.
We could have an action to supersede that.
We could, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've changed the 7 to 5 corrections.
So these should look familiar if you remember the, oh no, these are the appropriations. This is spending the pieces of the carry forward from last year's out-of-state beds. It's distributing the remaining, we had 1.3 remaining, you had it in the budget adjustment, that was the one piece that got pulled out of the budget
We have
adjustment.
$1 million for the IT system.
And so they are directing $1 million in this way. In the justice reinvestment to arena.
So
So
they're taking the $1 million and they're
Yeah.
not using any of it for the IT?
some D down on line 17
Oh.
is what would go to the offender management system.
And is that enough to,
No. They needed $1 million.
So I'm gonna just look to Sarah for a moment if the conversation was, these were done in agreement with DOC or not, these amounts of money.
I believe the discussion in justice oversight back in the fall was $1 million.
It wasn't justice oversight, it was in this committee at the request of DOC that you did BAA, you did the $1 million.
remember the memo that said
Yeah.
leave it up to appropriations? Then we asked DOC and they came in with their proposal, and of that, we appropriated some for the justice centers, but the $1 million for the IT, Representative Squirrel didn't want to agree to, so we held it out of the BAA. And now it looks like they are saying, rather than $1 million, it's half of the, they love
So
half.
indeed, they're
They
doing
love
that.
half. So the question is, does half get to anything?
Right.
And is that acceptable to DOC, or once again, are we spreading around the money?
Because the
at
House
the
didn't want to
expense-
give him $1 million. That was a big fight, Squirrel and I. And so then I agreed with him on at least getting 300,000 to the community justice center.
And that did go forward. in
And
the
that went
BAA.
forward.
That and the BAA, but the $1 million for the IT was left to this budget.
And that, so what you have in front of you on page 35, what the House Committee, the House.
So we may want to revisit it
Well,
and go
I
with
think
your
it
million.
should be, but I also want to question 250,000 for reentry services. Isn't that an ongoing base appropriations of the department? Or is this a new program they're starting? But I didn't hear about this from anyone. If I did, I forgot.
Maybe we just,
We did this.
I don't think it was never part of justice reinvestment. I thought it was base expenditure.
It says as provided by, which I read to mean it's already happening.
I suspect there's been a base expenditure and the House just pushed it over here.
So I think I don't see anything that takes anything out of the base. I think this is an add-on to that, a one-time add-on to that base.
I think we better hold, because the question is, are we divvying up the $1 million so that we don't have enough to do what needs to be done with the IT system in order to give, because they're giving more money to the community justice centers. Yeah, and so the question really is, once again, getting back to, do we really need the $1 million, or are we gonna, and so.
Yeah, we're gonna do a half-assed
Yes, that's sort of,
vendor management program, which is part of the problem right now.
Although the reentry program that Lund does and others do is really effective, so.
it's not, that's, we've dealt with one
Maybe we
separately.
should get rid of.
I think this is getting into, we had in the BAA $1 million, because that's what we were told was necessary to have this IT system, and the data is so important in all the policy making. So I'm going to suggest we revisit this, because it's a major redo of the $1 million, and see if we can get, probably the people that are getting the money here will be very unhappy if we say, no, the $1 million is necessary to do the data system. But I think we did give money to the justice centers in the BAA, and it was like 350 million, 50,000.
337 or something like
Yeah.
that.
So I think
So
we'll hold this.
I do need a recommendation from another committee in the House.
It did come from another committee. I'll get confirmation about whether the Department of Corrections was engaged in that conversation or not.
One would hope that the agency is reviewing this and would give us comments back. But I'm going to hold this because it just is revisiting that original testimony that they requested, we got from, recommendation got from the DOC. Okay. Shall we go to page 36?
Yes. So C102 and C103, these should also be familiar. These were the sort of technical fixes to the previous transfer and try and build it into the base language that we should put into the budget. We had this on the Senate side in the BAA. It came, these two pieces came out with the $1 million. There's a recommended technical correction from the fifth floor in C102 sub C. That's in the technical letter that you have in your pocket.
I don't frankly have that memorized with 39 pages.
Looking at it, we'll incorporate the technical corrections into that section, but the intent of these two sections are the same as what you intended in budget adjustment when you
All right, so
included them.
we're gonna have cosmic trust, and Stephanie tells us it's something that we agreed on. It got pulled out by the House, but we're putting it back
You pulled
in.
all the pieces out when you agreed with Representative Squirrel.
Oh, well, I'm not dealing with it.
Chair,
House.
Rowe?
Yeah.
Okay,
Representative Squirrel. Squirrely on $1 million.
yeah, well, sometimes, don't you remember, they, organic farmers were such a priority, they
I
had to
know.
put it in the BAA, and then they didn't even budget a dime in the big bill. Huh?
They put it out.
Well,
So, and
So-
The technical version is very simple. It's simply changing.
We believe you on the technical.
Okay.
All right, we're back to the $1 million. They go, we can talk about how we want to proceed on that.
Yep.
Okay, so we'll close those out,
Okay.
because we believe you, Stephanie. If you say that they're technical.
Well, it's saying it's spent over multiple years. And they want,
No, I believe
they
it's,
want to say carry forward.
okay.
Yeah, all right, so we're gonna close those out. All
All
right,
right, page 37, and now we're in the D part of the bill. And the D part is sort of the other money section where we transfer money, we state direct applications if there are some, we state whether there's anything reverting. And you will see at the end of the D section, this is where the House expressed their priorities for potential contingent expenditures, but they didn't actually write an actual appropriation. And so D100 is in every year. This is the distribution of the property transfer tax. This is where we notwithstand the formula. This is the section that does it. And the difference from the House, from the governor, is the House put the 10 million back in the base for VHCB, for housing and conservation, that you had put in the base last year. So they restored that. The governor pulled that back out for this year. So that is in. And then they have also increased the amount of money going to the municipal regional planning fund by $1.5 million.
and that's ongoing.
And that would be ongoing, you would expect. When
And and would you believe we're getting emails from the RPC saying they support what the House did?
I can believe you.
This is,
All right, so.
So you did have in your S100 some appropriations that were related to planning. And so you want to probably view
Yes, we're
the
putting,
increase of 1.5 here in the context of that request in the.
yes.
in the whole context of what we're gonna do around housing, this would come back to a place where we don't know until we deal with all of the pieces, what we wanna do here.
So what you're saying is, what you want to hold D100 and deal with it as part of housing.
You know what that,
As part
We'll
of
deal with
housing.
it as part of the whole housing package.
What about our RPCs?
Well, we,
There's funding for them here, but there's funding them in S100, so we've got to make sure that we're.
coordinate all of them.
I know your RPC is probably tuning in as we speak.
We are, and I worry about what Senator Westman does and some of his things at the last minute. I've known him well
My
for a lot of
name
years.
is
and
not
he-
Senator Sears.
No, he does tricky things.
My name is not Sears and Star.
I'm
I
worried
do
about-
not have an S in front of my name,
Wait a minute.
which means,
I've been around too long to watch Richie, so the
Alright.
reason they call him Richie Rich.
I'm going to suggest that D100 we look at as a package with.
With the housing.
With the housing.
The whole property components.
But as a committee, not just Richie.
He's the sub.
All right, let's move along.
Okay, so now we're on D101 on the bottom of page 38. And this is usually a long section of transfers, and there are lots of things to talk about in here. So we didn't really step away from the part cold money yet, but. So sub 1 at the top of page 39 are the transfers from the general fund to a variety of funds. The House agreed with the governor's $10.9 million transfer from the general fund to the transportation fund.
We did,
We might have a construct that moves it around in the context of the cash fund when we start to talk about that. So that's that $11 million. We talked about the fees raising 8, and this nearly $11 million. That's where I have the other 3 that's not covered by the fees in that. And then we talk about the other 25 that's needed. So that may be a different construct when we get to the cash fund.
because we're setting aside the match, which the House didn't have any match, the IIJA. So we're going to be looking at this as part of that total match discussion.
So even though they did the fees, they didn't put any of that revenue towards it.
So they still did this piece as well, and so that roughly 8 million would have carried forward and would have lowered the gap that they had, but they still have a gap.
So if there is the piece, what would they thinking,
Well, they did this and they raised the fees, but they didn't do the bigger $25 million gap. They haven't covered if they've done a portion of in the fee structure, a portion of the match.
Don't even ask, because you're asking for a response to a rhetorical question.
well, I don't understand if you're gonna raise the piece, why you might, I don't get it.
But maybe next year you'll get it.
All right, so the environmental contingency, that's, let's just go down through these.
So I did, the governor, I believe, had 10 million in this line item.
For environmental contingency.
This, I believe, reflects what they think they will need for 24. And it's mostly PFAS related.
This is
The
not.
Lincoln crisis response gets 120 grand.
So
Oh, that's, like,
So this is,
But is this not generally used for?
I think that was
it would, if there was a site,
Anyway,
but the school specifically, we did probably get that $5 million summer testing.
it might be.
And then
more,
the
but
32
last year was
million.
from, I think it's more in joint side.
That's still sitting.
So,
I'm trying to understand that she's telling for the PFAS,
For remediation.
I don't wanna short PFAS.
No, we're not shorting PFAS. I was just asking if the governor was $5 million higher partially based on PCBs. But it,
I don't know that we dedicate that to PCBs.
No, not necessarily, and it was $9 million in the
Oh,
dump
nice.
rec. And if I may, I think the House was looking at this from a kind of a cash flow perspective, what was needed from a cash perspective in fiscal year 24. And that's why it was reduced to 5 million.
And why the 9 million for the governor if it was more than what was needed? Was it to complete a project, or what's the difference between?
and if you're going just cash flow, in other words, is there more out there to be flowed and there's not the money to pay for it?
So the construct of the environmental contingency fund, it doesn't really have a steady revenue source. It has a teeny drip of
But my question was, why did the governor request 9? So we
Right.
move it down to 5. Is it okay? In other words, have we just recalibrated it based on actual, or are we just shortchanging it, knowing that we've got obligations that are just gonna come up just not within this fiscal year?
I'm not aware of an obligation, but it is a fund that, eventually there will be some
have to
need to
drill it
go
out.
test something and secure.
The only thing I'd ask about that is
Is anybody from the administration listening? Please give us the justification of your 9 million, otherwise it's gonna be 5.
But you'd have to do an awful lot of testing to spend 5 million.
But this is a lot, it's more than testing though.
Securing it, and I think in some sense you can, it just depends on the issue that comes up, the site that comes up, and what the extent of contamination might be.
But
They must have,
we know it's lumpy. We know that it's going to be sort of situation by situation. All I want to know is if, in fact, the 5 million is adequate and why the administration, if the administration feels that there's justification for 9 million, they need to get it to us pronto. Otherwise, it's 5 million. Simple.
that's fair.
Okay. And if you're listening out there, someone in finance and management, please get back to us. Otherwise, we'll agree with the House.
I just don't think that if something goes wrong, we're not gonna know on funding.
Absolutely.
And if we're in a position where this is the most revenue we're gonna have, this is someplace that, is that?
We still.
Yeah.
But don't worry, we have a lot more need than
Oh, I know.
So the enhanced, this is just to fill the gap for the
So-
deficit.
So it is, the 1.3 is the deficit, and that's the third year of the deficit, and then on top of that is another $815,000. The deficit in the Universal Service Fund, where it lands on E911, because they're the last entity to get funding from that fund, we have backfilled for 2 years, this will be the third year of backfilling the baseline. In that deficit, we have not been able to do their normal sort of sinking fund for their upgrades. And so the House has added the 815,000 here because they have a software upgrade coming and they have to pay for that. In the 3 years of having a gap, they haven't been able to, we've only made up the difference to make them function. We haven't made up the difference that build up that we have every 3 to 5 years on an upgrade related to equipment or software or something.
And they
911.
would still have to do this even with the dispatch. We asked Barbara, that question very specifically.
What's the rest of it?
The 1.3 fills the gap
Oh.
of the operating gap, and then the 815 is on top of that for the upcoming software upgrade. But the House Ways and Means Committee is looking at the Universal Service Fund and considering if there's an alternative way to source that fund that would eliminate the deficit.
But even then, you still have this.
You still have this at least for 24, or at least half of 24, because it will take some time to switch over.
Okay, so of these funds, the 815 shall support the upgrade. All right, so now we're down to D.
The lines 8 and 9, and this was a number that was $15 million from the governor, and that we heard from Secretary Naylor on.
And this is for the network?
This is the money into the IT modernization special fund.
Right.
But so the pieces of the IT modernization special fund have additional language that we'll get to.
My question is this what did they need to do the network? I thought that was 10. This is different than the state network.
So this is the money into the fund.
Right.
And I'm gonna go to where
Do you know when Sean came in, he said the House only gave them half, and I thought it was 5 million out of the 10 they needed to do the network upgrade so that we weren't having the problem with the network failing.
I'm just trying to find the language about the pieces of the, what.
Sarah?
I do, I don't know what page in there, Stephanie, but I know, so the original $15 million request, $10 million was for the network and security infrastructure.
Okay.
And then 5 million was for IT investments to modernize existing IT systems or to automate manual processes. And so I think in the House, they, yes.
I would say we have to, at a minimum, give them the 10 to the network.
But they must have been thinking about half this year and half next or something, because it's half of the total.
They love half, but the question, this is back to the comment, the testimony we got from the secretary who said, if you only fund half the network, then they had 7 months gap before they could get to the next phase. And the problem is, just like the court has experienced days where the network went down, that it's happening with the executive branch as well. And so,
Give them 2/3, they can get it all done and then come.
well, in other words, if the 10 million would be our priority, we want the network done. And then when we have 5 million to modernize existing systems, I think it's gonna have to go on the list.
The 10 million is what?
Sean said they need.
Yes, he said they funded only half of each, I guess.
And is that the House right language? IT oversight committee around any of these somewhere?
I think they did, Stephanie, let me.
That's what I was trying to find,
Yeah.
that would sort of define the two
I
pieces.
agree with you, I just want to confirm.
Yeah. And this is what I'm just having trouble finding, because I thought I had seen that.
it seems like expenditures that support the day-to-day functions of government.
You can't start a project and then.
Back to the
put your
1100s.
feet through it and go,
Yes.
I'm
Sorry,
gonna
I'm
wait
looking at the wrong
7
spot.
months.
Got page 105 in mine.
It doesn't seem very.
Page 105.
But it might be different, I think, for you guys.
You're
Online,
online, you're on
yeah.
the, I'm just gonna find it.
B1100 Y1.
So why couldn't they come back next January?
So at page
budget
18.
adjustment to get the balance? if they-
What page?
Well, the network, if you do that, there's a gap between what they've got funding and the whole project, so they'd have to put stuff on hold for several months. And it made no sense to delay it, it needs to be done.
And
So-
you do see the 5 million for the network on page 18, so they specifically cut the 10 million in half. And then they have the other 2.5 for modernization.
Most of these projects are done with contracts, and you go out and you let a contract, and then if you have to wait months before you can let the next one, it doesn't work that way.
I'm just concerned that we have a network that is inadequate and is at risk of failing. And state government can't do its work any more than the court could do its work. So I would say that is a core support system. And I would put the modernization of other systems on hold for consideration on the one time. We'll just go with fully funding the network replacement or upgrade, whatever it ends up being.
So on page 18, there's 5 million, that's one time, and then this is 7.5.
So this is the money into the IT fund, and what you see on page 18 is the money coming out of the IT fund. So
So we'll have to
they're
calibrate
bookends
them.
to each other. So this is the general fund going into another fund, and the spending is coming out of the other fund. They have to equal each other, or the spending has to be less.
So we're putting in- We're putting in
Spending can be
more,
higher.
we're fully funding the network upgrade or replacement and making that our top priority. And then on the list, if we've got money for the modernization of other systems, then fine, but if we don't, fine, and we'll have to, the language that you were referencing would just have to reflect if there's additional money for the modernization. But it would be 10 million for the network. So let's go capital projects. This is
what you would transfer into what we called last year the cash fund. They've called it capital infrastructure. They've renamed it in the house.
and we're gonna rename it.
Yes, I think.
We don't know what yet. But
And this dollar amount would change if the desire is to make the reserves within that fund, both the transportation piece and the water piece.
and just to let you know, I have talked with the chair of institutions about the fund and how much money out of the existing capital fund that they can spend, which is the same as the House had.
32.
Ended up like 39, was it?
So because 25 million went into the fund at the beginning of the year because of the way FY '23 closed out, there's that money in there, and so they are spending 39. The House spent 39.3, and the decision is to they could spend the same amount. They have to spend the 9.8 that is necessary in 24 and 25 for the water match under IIJA. And then this committee would be making the appropriations, the transfers, and the structure of the fund.
So that we're fully funding the IIJ match, but this year, the match was 9, they lowered it a little bit.
And it, up to, it's 9.3 that's needed for 24 and 25 to draw the IIJA water federal money.
It
that's
was
available.
9.7, they dropped it to 9. Was that originally?
I think it's 9.3 and then it's 20, it was 23.5, or maybe, I can't remember now.
But it doesn't matter, we're gonna, we'll fully fund the IIJA match for water sewer systems, which will really help housing, because a lot of communities are at capacity on some of those systems. And then we will
It is 9.8. I was conflating it with the COLA piece that's 9.2.
Okay, there are a lot of nines out there.
It happens every year, that there's a bunch of numbers that turn out really
And
similar.
9.1 for retired teachers COLA. So this will all be, this is gonna reflect what we get out of our institutions committee for the reserve fund, whatever it's called. And we told them they have the same amount of money to work with as the House did. And at least the institutions committee in the House, they didn't reserve, they didn't do, they just left
They left the balance there.
balanced.
They just didn't, they didn't put a corral around it for AJ.
You know, and I'm looking at the clock and it's almost 10:30. We're gonna need this room for a meeting. So I'm gonna suggest that we stop here.
Are we done on 31?
No, you're halfway done. You're at line 13. That's what we'll start tomorrow.
Unless these are the ones that we're gonna, this is what institutions has to work with in their 39.
So so the Rural Industry Development Fund is part of the Workforce and Economic Development piece.
Oh, it is.
And it's that seed funding for a revolving loan fund for industrial development that we heard from Commissioner Goldstein on.
Okay. So that is not in the capital bill.
That is not capital bill, that is gonna be fully in this bill, informed by the recommendations from the Senate.
I guess that's what I was wondering. So it's a blend. It's not all capital bill.
So, yeah.
We're on like a point.
So committee, I'm gonna